And today we are going to talk about point of view. Okay, so when you set out to write a book, the first thing that you want to think about is, of course, the story and the characters and what's going to happen. Once you sort of decide that, you have to sort of make a decision on who's going to get to tell that story and how is that person going to tell it. And there are many, many choices. Okay, so the first choice that you would have is called first person POV. So first person POV is a story where you start off with I, right? Like in Front Desk, the whole book is written from Mia's point of view. It's first person. She talks about my parents thought America was going to be like this, and I did this, and I got this, and I had to suffer that, right? So that's going to be your first person POV. It's actually my favorite type of writing. I love writing from a first person perspective. Why? Because to me, first person POV creates such a immediacy. Like you just immediately bond with that character, right? That character's point of view is your whole world in that story. That's the only worldview you have in that story. And so it makes you feel so connected to that person. And if you're a really voicey writer like I am, I love voice. I love playing around with voice. I love writing dialogue, all that kind of stuff. First person POV is a really great way to start writing. Now, of course, I was a columnist for many, many years. I was a columnist for about 10 years. I wrote for the SCMP, the South China Morning Post, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And in all of those opinion articles, opinion pieces, like 200 plus opinion pieces that I wrote over a decade, I started every single one of them with first person because it was all about from my point of view. I wrote a lot about education and about parenting and about culture and stuff like that. So that was sort of my background training. I'm someone who's very familiar with writing from POV. That feels really natural to me. For other people, it doesn't feel so natural. So there are some cons with writing from first person. Okay, the biggest con that I've heard is eventually you might run out of story. In other words, there's only so far that we can follow a person before we might get a little bit bored. Right? Like imagine like listening to the same person talk on the phone with you for days on end. You might want like another friend, right? It's the same sort of concept. And I think, there's a couple things you can do with that. One is just make sure you have enough story before you embark. So if you plan the whole thing out and you know exactly what's going to happen in your head, you will actually be able to fill the story with enough substance so that the reader doesn't get bored, right? Another thing you can think about is actually having two different people in the story tell the story. So in other words, having the story be told from not just Mia's point of view, but maybe Mia tells half the story and Jason tells half the story. And if the chapters intersect, that could be really, really interesting and suspenseful. And that's exactly what I did in Parachutes, right? Parachutes is a dual POV story. In other words, we have two people, Claire and Danny, and they have alternating chapters, one chapter Claire, one chapter Danny, and the chapters both start with I. So it's all first person POV, but from two different POV. Now, why did I do that? First of all, before I embarked on it, I had no idea how hard it was gonna be. I thought it would be like a cool challenge. It ended up being so hard, it like almost killed me. Like literally, I almost died writing this book, okay? It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do because essentially having two different people's point of view and having them intersect and weave in and out meant that I had to write two different books and basically mushed them together, which is what I did, which is what I had to do. And the reason why it was like having to write two different books was because when I tried to write this book sequentially, so chapter 1, then chapter 2, chapter 3, I ended up making the two characters feel almost too similar in my mind. Like it was hard for me to distinguish between them. And that's what frequently happens when you're writing a dual POV story, is that you will embark and you will encounter this challenge of how do I get these two people whose chapters I'm doing sequentially to stand apart. And the only way I could do it in the end was I had to rewrite the book. I had to first write this book entirely from Claire's point of view. Then I had to go back and completely rewrite the book from Danny's point of view. And then I had to merge the two together and merge the chapters and make sure that the interconnecting weaving points made sense. So it was a huge endeavor. I don't recommend it for beginner writers. I recommend it as an exercise because it's a cool exercise and there are lots of benefits to having it, but it's really hard. Okay, so what are some of the benefits? The benefits is that you get to tell the audience things that the other character doesn't know yet. So in other words, Danny at one point has information about Claire's boyfriend and about what's happening in the school that's going to directly impact Claire, and she has no idea, right? That was the only way I could pull it off, was by having a dual POV, right? Because I had this information, I didn't want Claire to know it yet, but I wanted the audience members to know it so that they would feel the sense of suspense and like, oh my God, she's getting herself into a bad situation, But she didn't know it yet. I wanted her to still go through the bad experience without knowing all of it, but I wanted the reader to know, and that's why I had to have two dual points of view in this story. Okay, so it was really, really hard, but there are huge benefits if you decide you want to try it. It can be really fun. It makes it harder for the reader to get bored because there's two different stories and two different plot lines. You have to be careful though that both plot lines are equally compelling. That's a thing that I often see when I'm reading dual POV, is that one character story is so interesting, the other character story is not really that interesting, that I end up skipping some of that other person's story so I can find out what happens to the person that I think is really compelling. So as a reader, we've all encountered this. That's why we have to make sure that before we embark, that both stories really are super compelling, equally compelling, and we have to be able to balance that so that we don't lose readers in the process. Does that make sense? And it was actually really interesting because Claire definitely, her story is a very big one in Parachutes. It's a very powerful story. It's very compelling, but so is Danny's. And when I started writing the story, and I remember going on submission with this book, we had a lot of editors offering on this book who said, I will only offer on this book if you agree to cut out Danny, and we just want to focus on Claire because her story is so compelling. Will you think about cutting out Danny? And I had a lot of people telling me this, and I really had at one point I was almost tempted to, but then I thought about it and I was like, no, this story in my mind is a story that is equally Claire and equally Danny. They're both super compelling. It's so important to see sexual assault, sexual misconduct from both these girls' lenses. I can't cut any of that out. So I went with an editor who said, sure, let's do both, right? But it was really, really hard, you guys. And so oftentimes you do have to do that soul searching. And then the opposite happened to me on 3 Keys, which is the sequel to Front Desk. I first wrote 3 Keys from a dual POV. I wrote it from the perspective of Mia, and then I wrote it from the perspective of Lupe, and I wanted to sort of do the same thing, merge it, and see what happens. And I ended up deciding that I wanted to rewrite this from the perspective of Mia because I am Asian American, but I am not Latino. So that lack of authenticity for me to use to write Lupe would have been, I think, a little bit of a problem. And I want to reserve that for actual Latino writers out there who are writing that story. So I wrote the story from the perspective of Mia, going through this experience, supporting her friend Lupe, being an ally, understanding what it's like to have a friend in a tough situation, entirely from Mia's perspective. So when we're looking at POV, it is important to take a moment and pause and think about, do I have the right to write from this person's POV, right? Especially if you're a non-person of color writing from the perspective of someone who is a person of color, you do want to take that pause and be like, can I pull this off authentically? Am I the best person to be writing this story? And if the answer is yes, you do need to make sure you can back that up. So I really do highly encourage people to have that additional layer of sensitivity when they are writing. And often when we do this, we actually are working with sensitivity readers, and we have an entire team of people who are advising us, doing a lot of just to check and make sure that we are absolutely doing the story justice, but also all the people that we're writing about, it really truly makes sense, the words that we're putting on the page because it is a big responsibility. It's a super big responsibility. Okay, the second type of POV is called the second person POV. That one is very rarely used in fiction. So that's the one where you're using a lot of yous. Like you do this, you know when you're at a party and someone acts this way and you just want to tell them to get out, or you know, da da da. So that happens sometimes in casual conversation. It frequently does, but it's hard to sustain an entire novel writing from a second person POV. So it's rare to see. The more common one, actually I think the most common one, is going to be your third person POV. So in a third person POV, you as the author can be anybody. Okay, so a great example of third person POV is Harry Potter, right? J.K. Rowling did not use first person. She said, Harry did this, Hermione did this, etc., right? Why would you use a third person POV versus a first person? First of all, it really gives you so much more freedom to write if you're writing from third person, because you're not limited in terms of what one person knows, right? You can really broaden the landscape of what everybody knows, because you can be this person for one paragraph, then you can be that person for another paragraph. It makes it easier for you to get through the story. It also makes it really interesting for your reader as well. I've actually never personally done an entire book from third person, I don't think. I'm not that good at pulling it off. I'm much more of a first person POV writer, but there's some writers who, obviously like J.K. Rowling, who just do a magical, amazing job, okay, with third person. And a lot of times when you're thinking about it, third person almost seems like a movie to me, right? In a movie, the lens, the camera is your POV, right? Everything the camera sees, your audience sees. If the camera is focusing on one person and shooting scenes which another person does not know, we're now with this person. If the camera flips to another person the next day and is shooting scenes that that person doesn't know, we're with that person. So in a movie, it's always going to be third person POV. And similarly, authors who use third person POV, they're thinking in terms of that camera lens, and they're switching that camera lens from person to person, from chapter to chapter, however they want. They can make it limited. So even though you're looking at all of the people in Harry Potter, you're still pretty limited in what you know, because you're still primarily limited to what Harry knows. It could be like that. I would say that J.K. Rowling probably a third person, more or less limited author. She wants to keep you focused on Harry, okay? But there are other authors who want to make it like you know everything, right? This is called third person omniscient, and you just know all the stuff that's going on with all these different characters. And that can be really exciting as well for the reader. What are the cons of third person? The biggest con for me is, first of all, it's hard to remember all the facts because there's so many different people. It's almost like too broad for me as the creator. If I used it, I'd almost feel a little overwhelmed, because it'd be like, oh my God, now I can write front desk from the perspective of Jason. And what about, Lupe? What about that girl who upset Mia? What about Mr. Gao should get, it'd be so big that I might feel a little unanchored in the story. Okay, so that would be my challenge number one as a creator, which is okay. Like you can rise to that challenge, or you can decide you want to do another POV, which is totally fine. Another big problem with POV, in my experience, is again that you don't have that immediacy. It's harder for you to completely bond with one character. Okay, so the best stories that use third person POV are stories with a huge ensemble cast where you don't need to bond with any particular person, right? Think of Friends, like the TV show Friends, right? We don't need to bond with Ross all the time. He can be annoying sometimes. We don't have to bond with him all the time. We can take turns. We can bond with Monica for one day. We can bond with Rachel. We can bond with Phoebe. We can bond with Joey. And those are the best stories to be told with third person, are stories that are huge, that have huge world building, a lot of fantasy stories, right? Think of your Game of Thrones, all of that stuff. You can't do that in first person because the world is too big, right? That's when you're gonna need more perspectives into the mix. Then the second thing is when you have a huge cast of characters where everyone is fairly equal. If everyone is fairly equal and there's no particular reason that you have to experience this story through one character, then I would say you should use third person, right? Like in Front Desk, it's going to be a totally different story if we experience it through mom and dad's eyes. I think it would be more boring because they'd probably just worry about money all the time and they wouldn't really have that much fun. Like, this is a hard story. It's a hard story because it's about real stuff like hardship of life and unemployment and things that they're going through, which we, like right now as a society, we're also going through. But the beauty of it is it's told through this hopeful little girl's eyes. And so when she sees the world, yeah, she sees the hardship, she sees the stuff that's terrible and bad and dark and sad, but she also sees the light, the humor, and all this other stuff. So that's why it's really important before we embark to decide which character is the best character through which to tell the story, right? Like, if you ask me my experience moving to America, it's very different from if you for you to ask my parents' experience, right? I might have one sort of story to tell you, and my kids might have another set of stories to tell you. My parents might have a totally different set of stories. All those tones are going to be different. All of those, all those scenes are going to be different. And so you want to decide what's the best person to tell the story, who gets to tell it, and who's going to tell it in the way that is the most compelling and dramatic for us as the audience member. Right? So like if we go back to, again, my favorite movie, Lion King, right? I always think, and I was really disappointed because I watched The Lion King, whatever, live action, or it's not, I guess it's not real live action, but whatever, it's the new Lion King. And I thought it'd be so cool to have the new Lion King be told from the perspective of Nala, right? Because I don't really understand why we have to hear that story from the perspective of Simba. And wouldn't it be awesome if we had this amazing female protagonist? Like, why doesn't she get to be, the one telling that story? And could be a totally amazing story, like different and modern, but sadly, the Lion King remake was pretty much the same as the Lion King original, which is still great, and I love the Lion King original, but you always want to think about who gets to tell the story, what is that story, how is it going to be different if we told it from one person's point of view than another person, okay? So do you guys have any questions on POV? Anything like that? Okay, so POV, once again, you get to decide. It's one of those things where you are playing God. You're the creator of this entire world. You are totally in control. You get to create the entire story, but you have to think about the tools you want to make, the tools you want to use to make that story. Okay? So question is, show, don't tell, show their personality through actions. Don't just say they're smart. Yes, showing, not telling is so important, you guys. If you read, Front Desk, you'll see that Mia is a very, spunky girl. She's someone who takes charge, and she's not someone who's easily discouraged. She goes through a lot of horrible things, but she's not easily discouraged. She's someone who grabs the problem and by the reins and tries to fix it. But how do we know that about her? It's through a series of events where you see her being tried and tested. Okay, another question is, how do you write unique characters, traits, and flaws? Once again, that's a really great question about character. We did a lesson about character a couple of sessions ago, I think. Maybe it was last week. And you can go back and watch it on my website, kellyyang.com. I would say that the best way to make your characters feel really real to life is to observe people. Okay, so if you have a lot of friends, which I'm sure everybody knows a lot of people, think about each person and what are their strengths and weaknesses. What are the things about them that are so amazing that blow you away? And there are things that are true about my friends that just completely blow me away. I'm just like, wow, that's amazing that you got through this situation, and that, it's incredible what you're doing. Like, some of my friends are working on their 25th book or something. It's just like, what? Actually, we're going to have one of them on the show. Stacey McAnulty, she's a really good friend of mine. She is the author of Lightning Girl, Miscalculations of Lightning Girl. She's going to be on the show on Wednesday to talk to you guys about pacing with me. So we're going to do it together. She's one of my best author friends, and I think she's on her like 20th book or 22nd book or something like that. So that's like an amazing character strength of hers. I don't know how she did it because publishing is incredibly hard, you guys, and she's there and she's done so many amazing things. So I always observe people and I want to be authentic in how I describe characters. And so I'll take different strengths, different weaknesses. I'll take my own weaknesses. I have a lot of weaknesses. I'm super uncoordinated and generally tend to fall, even though I'm like walking on a flat pavement. I'll find some way to fall. I guarantee it. But lots of different flaws that happen in like people, just anybody, my kids, my parents, whoever. And so I just sort of weave all of that stuff in and I'll create a character with flaws that feel sort of authentic. Okay, another question is, I have a billion projects that I never finish. Me too. I have a huge tendency to start things and I don't always finish them, but what I've become better at is I will write down ideas into my phone and then I will let the ones that have legs, right? If there are some ideas that you have that just won't go away, then probably that idea is worth pursuing. It's worth following, okay? If it just refuses to let go of you, then you should follow it for a little while and see what happens. If you have a ton of ideas and you don't know which one to start, go with the one that is the most urgent to you, that you have to write. Because remember, this is a very hard game. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, like writing is a hard game. It's a lonely activity sometimes. It doesn't have to be because you can also pure edit and so forth. But generally, you have to do it by yourself. There is no such thing as group writing unless you're working with someone on a book together as a co-writer or something like that. So you want to go with the ideas that feel the most urgent to you. And there have been some cases where I've put one project aside and said, I want to just table this for a while because it doesn't feel that urgent to me, but this other idea is so urgent. I can't eat, I can't sleep. All I do is just keep thinking about it, keep thinking about it. And that's the one that I have to write right now. And that's actually happened to me recently. I am on contract to write, several books, and those are all great, and I'm really excited. But I had this idea for a new book that I just could not get out of my mind. I talked to my agent. I was like, what do I do? It was almost like I was like just possessed by this idea. I could not function. I could not eat. I could not sleep. All I did was think about it. And my agent said, go write it. She was like, you know what? Give yourself permission to pursue the things that are not even in your contract that you just want to pursue right now. And that's what I did. I said, okay, I'm gonna start writing it. And I am in the middle of drafting that one, even though there are a million other projects that I'm supposed to be doing. How do you get yourself motivated to write? So this is a really good question. It's hard. Even as a New York Times bestselling author, it is so hard. Writing is my favorite thing to do, but it's also the thing that is hard to do. And it takes a lot of psyching myself up to do it. So one of the things that I like to do is give myself permission to not have to write a certain number of words per day, right? Like those kind of hard guidelines or hard targets, I don't think they really work necessarily in the arts. Like maybe they're fine for sports, but we're creating art here. So give yourself permission to not have to write like 1,000 words a day or 2,000 words a day, whatever the number is, right? Instead, find the joy first. So once you find the joy, whether that's just through, scribbling some ideas down on a piece of paper, in a notebook, like I keep a lot of notebooks where I'll write down ideas, I'll free write, I'll write, in my spare time, I'll write like things in my phone. I'm a mom of 3 kids, I don't have the luxury to just sit there whenever my inspiration kicks in. I am probably grocery shopping or something. So will write a lot on my phone, and I just tell myself all of that stuff counts as writing, right? Thinking about writing, taking notes on your phone, right? Writing a line on your, email, just to email yourself, emailing yourself an article, right? Doodling on a notepad, all that counts in terms of writing. So you have to broaden the way you think of writing. It's not necessarily sitting at a desk cranking out words. Okay, once you broaden the description or the definition of writing, which by the way, I hope one thing that you get across from my stories is a lot of writing is planning. Okay, it's so much planning and actually not that much writing. So once you've planned out everything, your actual job of writing it becomes so much easier. And so I tell myself that anytime that I'm thinking about a story, that all counts as writing because it's part of planning. And if I plan it really well, then when I actually sit down to write it, it's not gonna be that hard because I'll literally know exactly what I'm going to write. And so I can't screw up, right? So once you redefine how you think about writing, it goes by much more quickly, it's more fun, you'll be able to come up with lots more ideas, and it's really, really great. So another question is, when should you change to a different person's POV in third person? Okay, great question. We are going to ask actually another author who's going to come on the show on Friday, Daniel Jose Older, who's one of my dear, dear friends, and he's a fantasy writer, and I think that he would be better in terms of answering that question because he does write in third person POV. I don't usually write in third person POV, so I would say probably off the top of my head, you would switch when you have urgent information that's better told from another person. But that's because I don't routinely write in third person POV. Does that make sense? So we're gonna have more and more people on the show, author friends. We're gonna do it together, so you guys don't just have to listen to me babble on, but you can listen to more people who are all experts. We're all deciding to do this because it's really fun, and we wanna engage with you guys. We want you to feel less alone through writing, but also through this particular hard time of school closures, and we have the COVID-19 and all that anxiety. So let's just get through all of that together. Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of Monday and Tuesday, and I will see you guys back here on Wednesday with my friend Stacy, and we're gonna talk about pacing. All right, thanks guys, bye.